how was it that you decided to go to Greece?
Okay, I was living on Long Island, teaching high school in Kings Park, Long Island, teaching English. I have a father who was Greek. I was reading a few books by different authors, one of whom was Henry Miller, influenced me the most, I'd say. And one book of his called The Colossus of Marousi, all about his adventures in Greece in 1941, when he went to the island of Corfu with his friend and fellow writer Lawrence Durrell, and spent about almost a year there. And his description of Greece interested me in Greece altogether. Then Lawrence Durrell, after the war, in Cyprus there was a war between the Greek Cypriots and the English. The English were in control of Cyprus. He, being from Britain, became a public relations officer for the British government. But at the same time, he was identified very much with the Greeks on the island. And he lived in a place called Belapes, and wrote a beautiful book called Bitter Lemons, all about his experience in 1956-57. So this, I'm talking to you now, I started teaching in 59, and it was 1962, I think, mainly when I came across, 1961, 62, I came across these two authors. And then also Kazantzakis, who was a Greek author who wrote Zorba the Greek, wrote a book called The Odyssey, a Modern Sequel, and that was all about Greece too, and also a book called Spiritual Exercises that he wrote when he was a young man in the Mount Athos. So all these things were interesting me about Greece. But every night when I was teaching, from 10 p.m. to 10:45, there was a program on WOR from New York, and it was a comedy program with Gene Shepard, who was a very funny storyteller. And he used to say, now this is 1962, so Kennedy was the president. There's a tremendous spirit of exploration and opportunity for young people. It wasn't like you were confined to a certain kind of a routine or job or position. Especially he and other people had said, you're kind of like young aristocrats. You're not really, you're free to go in any direction you want. This is before drugs. He was really speaking about the spirit of Kennedy. It was a wide open, optimistic attitude. So I wasn't afraid that if I gave up my job, I wouldn't get a job. Anyway, Gene Shepard would say, if you want to go to Europe, talking to young people and just generally, don't wait until you're married and have kids or get retired. Go when you're young, when you can. So, and then I was teaching in the spring of 1962, and one of my father's friends, Mr. Chris Bastis, who was a Greek ship owner, let my father know that I was invited to go on a sailing ship, a yacht, across the Atlantic, stopping off at various ports on the Mediterranean, a sailing yacht. But I was in the middle of teaching, and I couldn't leave in April to go, But he did give me an offer that then, if that wasn't possible, that in the summertime I could go on a tanker. So I decided to go with all these different influences. And so around July 1st, I flew down to New Orleans and got on a tanker on the Mississippi, and I was the only passenger. So, and then the tanker went through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, all the way to Turkey, into a city called Iskenderun. So it was about a 21-day voyage, and perfect weather, delicious food, and I was the only passenger aboard the ship, and I had the cabin sort of equivalent to the captain's cabin, because there were only 2 cabins on board. And I was invited to have meals with the crew, and I read the Odyssey, a Modern Sequel by Kazantzakis, and I wrote in my journal and just was enjoying, if you've seen the Titanic and you know the scene when Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, right? Kate Winslet, were up on the bow, and he had her close her eyes, and then he held her, and then right at the very pinnacle of the bow, he opened up, and they opened up their arms, and it's sort of like, I am the king of the world, or something like that, as the boat. Well, I was right at the bow of this ship for hours, and I could just peer over and watch the dolphins at play, and I infuriated the crew, they were all sweating away, chipping at paint, and I got to know them pretty well. And they did play one game called Biz after the meal, where one person was selected, stand with one hand under his arm and looking forward, and everybody else, the whole crew of workmen, stood behind him. And one person stepped forward and smacked the hand as hard as he could, so that then you would turn around, and you had to figure out who it was who hit you, who smacked you. And if you didn't, and they were all going, bzzz, and if you didn't get the right guy, you had to turn around and they'd do it again. So, some of them took great pleasure in giving me a thwack, as hard as that really hurt sometimes. And I did do some things. We would sit together. Most of them knew English a little bit, and they were all Greek, and I wrote love letters to their girlfriends in English, so that I made up for my, being able to take it easy while they're sweating all day long. And the meals, by the way, were not Greek food, because Greek food is pretty primitive, but Turkish food is exquisite. It's a cuisine, somewhat equivalent to the French cuisine. So they had a Turkish cook, and the food was absolutely incredible. I never had such delicious food one day after the other. And I remember every morning I'd wake up and I'd go to the stern. They had a big urn of coffee, and you could mix in some sugar and some canned milk, the Carnation canned milk. And it was delicious, sitting watching the ship go through the water and the wake behind, and drinking this hot coffee with canned Carnation. It was delicious. It was fun. So we got to Iskenderun, and it was overdue. It should have taken much less time. The captain had put too much fuel. It was a tanker, too much fuel in the bow, so the boat was not on an even balance, and so it took longer to get there. And I found this out later. And then I took another boat, like a ferry boat, from Iskenderun, Turkey, to Cyprus, which is maybe 40 miles away. And there I notified, somehow I was able to notify my relatives who I'd never met on Cyprus, and they came to greet me, and they took me to Lefkanico, as my father's village. And they treated me, royally, like I was a long-lost cousin. I'd never seen them, but they knew my father, Stephanos. And it was funny, when I got off the boat, I went to Larnaca, I think it is, then took a taxi cab to Nicosia. He dropped me in the Turkish section of the city. I didn't know Turkish, Greek, there were two different sections. And as soon as I got out of the bus, I saw all these people, some of them looking exactly like my father. So I think, that was interesting. Then my relatives arrived, and somehow I pointed to these men who looked like my father. He said, "Oh, those are Turks." So the nationalities had obviously mingled through the years, so you couldn't really tell by their appearance. And they took me to Nicosia, and the big event that took place after meeting my uncle, who had 4 daughters. I was 23, right? 24, I think. I was 25. So he had daughters in 19, 17, 14, 12, or something like that. And we had a lot of fun together. They had a nice house in Nicosia. He had a cafe on Lidra Street, which is the main street in Nicosia. But the big event for me in going this time, they brought me to Lefkanico in the daytime. and a woman greeted me. An old woman who was 93. I think her name was Maritza. Really exquisite, a tall, very elegant woman with very, all you could see all the veins in her arms, and elderly, 93 years old. And she heard I was coming, and she was the first one to greet me, and she took me in her arms, and she was almost crying and saying, Iostu Stefel, which means the son of Stephen. And this woman, as they explained to me, who couldn't speak English, was my father's mother's best friend. And my father's mother died giving birth to my father. So it was, but she knew my father when he was growing up, of course, in the village, and I guess my father knew her too. But it was this moment of sort of 3 generations, holding me, and it was really an extraordinary moment of connecting with the past of my father, someone who knew my father's mother, and my father never knew his mother because she died in childbirth.